Welcome to Pathways, where you are invited to join me for a visit with leaders in personal development and cultural evolution. This is your host, Paul O'Brien. For years, sensitive personality types have lived with the fear of being perceived as a little bit crazy. As a result, they've been hiding their gifts, withdrawing from the world, or just shutting down emotionally to avoid judgment by others, anticipation of pain, or sensory overwhelm. If you are feeling marginalized or anxious, out of sync with the mainstream world, overwhelmed by outside stimulation, or that your gifts are undervalued by society and your peers, then the book we discuss today may help. Our guest is Courtney Marchesani, author of the new book, 4 Gifts of the Highly Sensitive. Embrace the science of sensitivity, heal anxiety in relationships, and connect deeply with your world. Courtney is the developer of the Highly Sensitive Gifts Test, named as the 2017 Hay House Writers Workshop Award winner. Her insights into sensitivity help readers identify their gifts of intuition, empathy, vision, and expression to maximize their potential, while also learning how former trauma may have shaped them. Hello, Courtney, and welcome to the Pathways program.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for having me.
Okay, let's start by asking you, as the author, what is your definition of what it means to be highly sensitive?
Well, highly sensitive people were studied in the 90s, the early 90s, formally by Dr. Elaine Aron. So she's the first one who formalized sensitivity. We know it's always been there. It's an ancestral heritage. It gets passed down biologically, but she was the first one who kind of cemented the foundation with her highly sensitive person scale. So people that are highly sensitive respond more to sensory stimulation in their environment. They perceive more information and they respond faster emotionally. It's called emotional reactivity. And so it's called depth processing. And we're 1 in 4 or 1 in 5. So 20% of the population is highly sensitive. And it's not considered a disorder or a disability. It's a personality trait.
And why does society marginalize the highly sensitive? Or why has that been the case?
Because sensitive people perceive more, and they respond faster emotionally to what they're perceiving in any environment, whether it be with others, at work, it doesn't matter. And so that's kind of what they're known for, is being responsive. And those responses that come out can be perceived as negative. And you hear a lot of pejorative words being used. You're weak, you're soft, you cry too much. I mean, there's so many different negative associations with sensitivity. And so I tried to do the flip side of it and look at the positive aspects of it.
And why do we talk about what are the major positive aspects of being sensitive?
Because sensitive people can be in their environment and perceive more through sight, sound, feeling, touch, taste, smell, the 5 classical senses. They can connect in a deeper way also to beauty, harmony. They seem to be able to detect patterns in environments or in relationships or even at the world at large through different types of systemic thinking. So there's all kinds of positive aspects of that deeper connection and deeper processing, because not only are they feeling everything at a deeper level, they're processing more information on the fly. So they're usually very intelligent, adaptive. There's a whole bunch of positive things that come into that vein.
And you write in your book, quote, "It is my belief that sensitive people are the evidence of the next level of human consciousness." I wonder, are the numbers growing?
Well, definitely through the pandemic. I mean, the research has shown that sensitive people, when they remove themselves or isolate from an environment because they're feeling too much, seeing too much, hearing too much, it's just too intense, and they go beyond their threshold, they isolate and they remove themselves. When that happens, sensitivity kicks in more. We become more sensitive when we isolate ourselves. So we just went through a pandemic, a global worldwide pandemic, when we're all been isolating for the last year, some of us for a year and a half. And so we're going to become more sensitive. So just evolutionarily, yes, there's going to be more of us. In this next group of children that are born in, 2021, 2022, they're going to be more sensitive children. There's no doubt about it. Just because of the trauma, the collective trauma we just lived through together as a global society.
And do you think that there's evidence of that already in terms of some of these movements that are calling for compassion and greater tolerance for diversity, et cetera?
I do. I think that right now the data is probably not there, but it has shown that typically around 20% of the population has, fit this adaptive personality. And the reason why is because it's called biological sensitivity to context. That's the scientific name for it. It's also called biological sensitivity survival strategy. So there's only a smaller portion of the population that typically has this, because the way the scientists have been theorizing it, they don't necessarily it wouldn't necessarily help society if all of society was sensitive, because the benefits and the costs to sensitivity make it more difficult and challenging to live with, as most sensitive people know, because we experience more. So I'm out on that. I'm not sure if we're going to be higher or not, but I think that the movements you're talking about are definitely related, because sensitive people want more compassion, social equity, justice, and all those things are always top of our mind. So we're going to advocate for those things, whether we're in business, corporations, movements, definitely.
Your book could be considered a recitation on the origins of the gifts of sensory intelligence, as you call it, but how is it also a bridge to the future?
I think it's a bridge to the future because science is starting to show it. Okay, a lot of these things were probably theorized by individuals for a long time. We know sensitivity was bandied about. Oh, she's sensitive, he's sensitive, and it was common language, common parlance for a long time. Sensitivity has been known. But I think the thing that we're seeing evolutionarily now is science being able to show it and make it factual. One of the studies that I thought was groundbreaking and fascinating was in the intuitive chapter. Stanford did a study on intuitive people. They took 100 intuitives who were also what they called high performers, and high performers were able to, have hyper focus on their job, solve problems faster without logical reasoning. They put these individuals in an MRI and looked at their neuroanatomy, and they found that in the caudate putamen, an area in the midbrain that connects to the central nervous system that was thought to be just like voluntary motor movement, they found that they had a thickened white matter. And when they looked at the family members of these intuitive people, they also had the thickened white matter. So they were able to zero in on this area of the brain and show that intuitives have thickened white matter and have more intuitive thought processes. But they also had other experiences that they called anomalous. So things like hearing voices, seeing discarnate spirits sometimes, or individuals that have passed, ghosts. Being able to, sometimes they saw lights in the sky. That was another thing. So these experiencers, what they called them, were also highly intuitive, and they had neuroanatomical changes called genetic hypomorphic genes, and the other sample population didn't. And so we're seeing science being able to explain some of this theoretical stuff now through actual MRIs and physiological changes. They don't know why these physiological changes have taken place, but the hypomorphic genes show that they are different.
Is there any correlation with gender? I know that female brains and male brains are different to some extent, having to do with this white matter, et cetera.
It seems to be that there in some studies more women. In the study of the 100 at Stanford, there were, I think, 60 men and 40 women. So they were more men in that study. So you'd have to do metadata or meta-analysis in all the studies to see that. But mostly it's split down the middle equally.
I see. Okay. And is it inherited or learned?
It's both. So it is inherited. It's a predisposition, a genetic predisposition. And then through the environment, it's also learned, and you can become more sensitive through the environment. That's kind of where my book departs a little bit from the general consensus. I talk about trauma, and I go into trauma and how trauma shapes that sensitivity even more. Now, sometimes you don't have to be in a traumatic environment. There is a predisposition. The genes got turned on in the family somewhere. But I think my position or my opinion is that you become more sensitive if you've had early life experiences that are adverse or traumatic.
Okay, so let's talk about the four gifts. And there's a lot in your book about each of these four gifts that you call sensory intelligence. And we've
Yeah.
got empathy, intuition, vision, and expression. So let's just give a brief description of each one of those.
Sure. The intuitives are individuals, we kind of touched on them with the Stanford study, but they are individuals that are able to get information from their subconscious in lightning fast, and it goes beyond intellectualism or logic or thinking through things step by step. And 1, 2, 3 equals 4. It's fast, it's lightning quick. And so they are able to process an extreme amount of information into their subconscious without tracking it consciously. And then when they need an answer, they get it. It's going from A to Z without knowing how or why. The intuitives are also able to make connections that are, I would say, seamless, where they can see the big picture. They're looking at connections. They're making, they're connecting the dots, and they're connecting it to the bigger picture. And so they're great systems thinkers, inventors. And sometimes intuition overlaps with other gifts, and I can explain that in a little bit. But that's intuition in a nutshell. Empathy, empaths feel other people's feelings within their own mind and body. So they pick up subtle sensations about feelings, and sometimes thoughtful feelings, in their own physical sensory awareness, which is phenomenal. It can be difficult to process because a lot of that is coming in all the time. And if you're not aware that you're empath, it can be disturbing. But empaths are able to feel motivations of other people. They're able to discern sometimes even thought patterns. And they can read microfacial expressions, body language, body movement. I mean, empaths are the ultimate sensors, physical sensors. And so then they learn how to translate that. The other gifts, expression, are the quintessential artists. There was a type of sensitivity when I did all the research called aesthetic sensitivity. It's kind of a subtype. So aesthetic sensitivity is where I drew from for the expressives, because they seem to be able to go into any environment and perceive beauty with that depth processing or depth perception, and they translate it through their own physical embodiment, mind, body, and spirit, and synthesize it and create kind of an artistic fusion through their own perception, and then they create from that. So writers, dancers, cinematographers, anybody who's an artist who's creating through their physical mind and body, through the language, the beauty of language, that's expressive. And then there's the visionaries. The visionaries are the ones that have a facile ability to process visual stimuli through their visual awareness, and most likely spatial awareness in their mind's eye. So they're always taking things into the mental field, turning them over, looking at things different ways. They're the quintessential problem solvers. They're always looking to solve problems, and they use their visual mind's eye to do that. And I talk about this in the book, but just to kind of sum it all up, all these different types have like subtypes within them. So that's the beauty of the book, where I go into the compassionate empath, and I go into the auditory intuitive and the different types of gifts, so that people who are reading it can kind of see themselves and figure out what type of sensitivity gift they have. And the subtle part of it is, how does it express itself in unique ways in their own reality?
So do you feel that your book goes beyond just helping sensitive people understand themselves? Of course, it helps other people understand them, but does it also empower them, in your view?
I hope so. I mean, that was my intent, was to help people who didn't necessarily know. A lot of times we don't know how sensitive we are, but we do in relationship to others when it becomes important in our relationships and our communication styles and the way we live. So I hoped not only for sensitives to gain insight, but people who live with sensitives to gain insight too about their person and how that could help. And it can make relationships really amazing. I think a lot of times we hear about the negative side of it, that sensitivity is an impingement or a difficulty or a problem in relationships because people have a hard time dealing with sensitives because of their issues. But it can be a really beautiful thing that connects people in a deeper way.
And you mentioned these issues. What kind of issues might be associated with sensitivity?
Fears, anxieties, especially with empaths. Empaths really can feel what their partner is feeling. And if you have one partner who's had a difficult day or experiencing something super challenging, they come home and they bring that home, and the empath can just feel it immediately. And even if the other partner doesn't want to talk about it, the empath will continue to say, what's wrong? What's wrong? What's wrong? And they're picking up on the signals, and the other person's just like, obviously they don't want to talk about it, or they're not a verbal processor. And so that can be problematic for empaths. And then you have the intuitives that are always intuiting what's going on. And so that can also be problematic when intuitives are, sensing there's something disconnected. They'll have the same kind of response pattern where they'll try to help. So it can be difficult in those ways, in very practical ways between couples or even just working relationships. It depends on the context.
It seems to me that sensitive types, and I think I fall into that category, might have more trouble avoiding fatalistic thinking or catastrophic thinking, like particularly in the face of things like climate change or overpopulation. How can they, what is your observation of that? And what advice might you give relative to that?
Well, we're definitely more anxious because we're perceiving more information. And if we're not aware, if we're not consciously aware as sensitives that we're perceiving more information coming in, it's anxiety provoking. When you start to recognize that you're perceiving more information and that you're a sensitivity basically sensor and processor, you can start to work with it in ways that are very realistic. So my feeling is that because it is most likely an evolutionary trait, and we're born with it because we are supposed to be sensors, literally sensors for survival, for our tribe or our communities. My feeling is the reason this works as a paradigm is because we're also maybe getting answers, right? Solutions. That's why the visionaries have this problem-solving function where they're always kind of looking at how to solve things. So I do believe that we have answers. If we're looking negatively at everything and just stopping there, that could definitely be a deal breaker, an ender. Because if you're just looking at the negative part, there's nowhere else to go. But if you're also thinking about solutions and how to solve for things, then it becomes a beautiful gift and an ability. And so I do think that we need as sensitives to stretch ourselves and just get out of the negativist, thinking and try to see how it could be applied. Why am I concerned? What's important about this? How can I get involved? Because then that lends our voice into areas where decisions are being made that are important for society. We need to be involved as activists and, helping any way we can.
Now, your book points out that sensitivity began to be studied in the 1990s by Dr. Aron, and she invented this test called the Highly Sensitive Person Scale. And you
Yes.
have that test in your book, I believe.
I did a different test. Her test is online. She has the original test that has been studied cross-culturally. It's been validated by 4 and 5 factor analysis. My test is something new that goes into the actual gifts that hasn't been done before.
Okay. And so, I would assume that such testing instruments have evolved, have improved since the 1990s. Do you think that's the case? And do you think that your test is a particularly good one? And is it possible to give a test like that in the context of a book?
Yeah, well, psychometric testing is one of the only ways that they've been able to study sensitivity. It goes back way before Dr. Aron, okay? Psychometrics goes back to the basically the beginning and the genesis of the intelligence quotient. And it's a highly controversial method, but it's the one thing that's lasted the test of time through biological and cognitive psychology and all the different types of psychology, psychometrics have lasted. And the reason why is because they can get information. Hers was a questionnaire. It was a 27-point questionnaire, and she did a Likert scale where she also had strength attached to the different attributes. So I definitely think that it can help to zero in. They're not perfect. And so mine is just at the beginning. And so I continue to take data and try to make it better. And so right now I have a new one that's emerging where I'm looking at the way people are giving me feedback about the test and what they think and how their results are coming back. And I'm also seeing trends. So I'm seeing a new type of gift emerge out of that. So it's constantly evolving. The tests are constantly evolving and getting better.
And what is this new gift that's emerging?
There seems to be a certain type where it's an intuitive visionary. So they have intuitive, processing as a primary, and then they also have visionary, and then they have an expressive component. And so I'm seeing a very specific, unique type where these are individuals who are definitely probably cinematographers. They are being able to use their spatial awareness as a way to express. So they're definitely storytellers because they're expressing through their intuitive and visionary qualities. So I'd kind of conceived of it, but I thought it was a pretty small part of those gifts, but it seems to be a larger proportion. So I'm going to keep looking at that and evaluate it and talking to the people who take the test to find out more.
Now, in your book, you touch on sensory therapy, you call it, and a mind-body method. Can you speak to that?
Well, when I started to look for holistic medicine, and when I had experienced my own medical, issues around this. I didn't know about sensitivity. I certainly didn't call myself a sensitive at the time, but I had actual medical issues because of it. And without going into detail, I went to see a neurologist, and he was like, you have anxiety. And I didn't really feel that at the time that I was, crippled by anxiety. Now, maybe I was, and I just wasn't conscious of it, but I didn't think so. So I was really physically debilitated by my sensitivity, and I didn't know it. So I started to look towards holistic medicine for options. And there wasn't a whole lot. They were basically like my primary doctor said, you just have to recognize that medicine's not an exact science. Well, that wasn't good enough for me. I was like, there's got to be answers to help me. There's got to be a diagnosis, and there never was. And so I started to look into complementary medicine. I had a strong, rigorous background in psychology. I worked at a trauma center. I kind of felt like there's got to be a way. If there's a will, there's a way. So I dove into, in the early 2000s, complementary and alternative medicine. And that's when, years later, I found sensory therapy was based out of Ayurveda and the Indian tradition of medicine. They had a whole discipline about sensory healing. And their whole medicine and their traditional medicine talks about the reason why people get sick or have disease is because they're not honoring their senses. And when I read that, I was like, yes, share more. So I went into the field of Ayurveda and other forms of holistic medicine that directly address and deal with sensory overwhelm, essentially is what it is, clinically.
I see. Now, we've only got a few more minutes, and I want to quote your book and ask you to speak on that. You write, even though we may have forgotten the soul's language, it can still be a vital salve for self-healing. Magnificent healing dreams and visions are how we first experience it. And then you write, if sensitivity truly is a meaningful connection to the soul's perception, we are already tuned into this information through dreams, intuitions, and visions. So speak.
Did I say that?
You're bringing the soul.
That sounds very enlightened.
It sounds enlightened to me, but you're bringing the soul into the equation. And so how does that fit?
I do believe it's connected. I think that I've experienced myself and my own perception, my own subjective experiences visions, prophetic visions that came true. I mean, I couldn't ignore them. I didn't detail them in this book, but it's one of the reasons why it led me to explore this topic. And I have seen it in other people too. And it led me to believe there was a soul. I was an atheist for a period of time. And these experiences forced me to confront and change my belief system and open my mind to the fact that there were people communicating to me from the afterlife, things that I couldn't have known. And I had to look at that scientifically even and say, this is proof. And so right now I just got accepted to the Bigelow Institute of Consciousness Studies as a competitor to write a 25,000 word essay on the survival of consciousness after physical bodily death.
Wow.
So I'm going to take my hypothesis from this book that I just wrote and was published and use that to bolster my argument, because I do believe we are in contact with our soul. And I believe that once we tap into that, it gives us greater meaning about our life and why we're living now.
Well, I found your book very inspirational as well as educational. And I want to thank you very much for writing it and for being on Pathways today to discuss it with us. It's been a lot of fun. And I really
Thank you.
And there's so much more that we could explore or talk about in the book. You know, you talk about how the sensitive can help create a better world, and there's just so much there. I really want to encourage Pathways listeners to take a look at your book, The 4 Gifts of the Highly Sensitive. And I want to be sure to tell our listeners about your website too. I've got it down as www.inspiredpotentials.com. Is that the best one for you?
Yeah, that's right. And that's where the test is too. If you want to find out what your individual gift is, it's right there on the top of the website. So I encourage listeners to take the test, and I'll send you a little email of what your gift is. And then if you're curious, you can send me emails or ask any questions you might have about the gifts.
Beautiful. That's inspiredpotentials.com. And for those who may have tuned into Pathways late, this is your host, Paul O'Brien, author of a book entitled Intuitive Intelligence, a book that shares the theme of Pathways, which is personal and cultural evolution. And don't worry, you can play or share this interview whenever you want via the internet or as a free podcast, and I'll tell you how in a minute. Today, we've been visiting with author Courtney Marchesani, author of The 4 Gifts of the Highly Sensitive. Embrace the science of sensitivity, heal anxiety and relationships, and connect deeply with your world. And I want to say thank you to all of our listeners for tuning into Pathways, which is broadcast and streamed on the internet at www.kboo.fm every other Sunday morning at 8:30 USA Pacific Time. And even better, podcasts of today's show, which you can listen to and forward to others, are available for free at divination.com, and that's spelled DIVI nation.com, as well as via iTunes and other free podcast servers. This is Paul O'Brien, and reminding you to tell your friends about Pathways Radio and podcasts. And thanks again to Courtney Marchesani and to all of you listeners for tuning in and being a part of the Pathways conversation.